From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the Inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now here's your moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I welcome you to the fourth program in our 6-week series entitled The Issue of Censorship in America, Is the First Amendment Dead? On program 4, we're going to analyze the issue of the responsibility of the media in dealing with the First Amendment. And we could not be more fortunate than to have the distinguished guest that we have today on that particular issue. I welcome to Idaho and to our program Richard Valeriani, who has a distinguished background and many, many years in this field. Our guest, who speaks Spanish, Italian, and French, joined NBC in 1961 in Havana, but returned to the United States following the Bay of Pigs invasion in May of that year. He has covered numerous stories and programs, including the civil rights stories in Birmingham and Selma, as well as the anti-American rights in Panama and the fighting in the Dominican Republic in 1965. He joined NBC's Washington Bureau in 1965 and covered the White House during the Lyndon Johnson presidency. After covering the campaigns of both Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, our guest was assigned to the White House. In 1970, he was named State Department correspondent and remained on that beat until returning to the White House in 1972, in time to cover President Nixon's first visit to the Soviet Union. Our guest also, from November 1973 until December 1976, he logged over 500,000 miles covering Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who is the most well-known Secretary of State in our times. He also covers Secretaries Vance and Ed Muskie. Our guest also is the author of a critically acclaimed book entitled Travels with Henry. Mr. Valeriani, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Good to be here.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have panelist Janelle Burke, an attorney in Idaho, and I shall invite Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Mr. Valeriani, as a member of the press, what is your view of the First Amendment?
I think that the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of the press, essentially ensures the survivability of all our other freedoms. But the point I make most about the First Amendment is that we are always asked as reporters, as newsmen, what we think about the First Amendment. The First Amendment is not there to protect us. It's there to protect the people. It's there for the benefit of the people so that they have an uninterrupted flow of information.
And can you tell us from a personal experience, perhaps, how the First Amendment related directly to your work?
I guess the best example is Grenada, the invasion of Grenada, when I was sent down to cover the American invasion, and I was forced to cover from the trenches of Barbados for the first 3 days because the U.S. military excluded the media. What was interesting at the time was that the American people overwhelmingly supported the exclusion of the media from coverage. In retrospect, or I should say later, it came to be seen for what it was, which was a blatant act of censorship.
I know from some of the work that you've done and that I've had access to recently, you have very strong feelings about the role of the media in covering such issues as foreign policy, and particularly the questions of war. In both Grenada and Panama, and now Desert Storm, something has happened that has been very much a change in that process. And please feel free to take the time that you need to talk to us about how you view this new position that the media has been placed in particular the pool system.
I think the roots obviously lie in Vietnam. There are a lot of people in the military who still believe that the press, quote, lost the war in Vietnam, who still don't understand what really happened there. A lot of the people who were lieutenants and captains in Vietnam are now colonels and generals, and therefore make the policy. So I think you go back to that. Then come to the Falkland Islands, which I also covered. And there I was forced to cover from the trenches of Buenos Aires, where the greatest danger to reporters was the daily ingestion of high amounts of cholesterol, eating good Argentine beef. In the Falklands, the Argentinians did not allow reporters to go to the islands themselves. That was understandable for a dictatorship. The British imposed very severe restrictions on their own media. They don't have a First Amendment. Now, I think a lot of people in the Pentagon watched this, saw the successful outcome, liked the way the Brits handled the media and controlled the news flow, and said, that's the way we ought to operate. And then when Grenada came, they did the British one better, and they simply excluded us from any coverage for the first 3 days. Then once, in effect, the fighting had died down, we were allowed in. After Grenada, the media and the military tried to work out an arrangement. The media complained a lot about Grenada, to work out some kind of SOP, some kind of modus operandi for future events involving military operations. Well, the first one after that was Panama, and the arrangement was observed mostly in the breach. Now, I think that is the historical background for it. But as the military, with a Vietnam mentality, watched the way the Brits operated in Falklands, did it fairly successfully from their point of view in Grenada and again in Panama, and I think this was the inevitable result. There was the decision made to make this the good news war and not to have the media poking around where they shouldn't be poking around. If you look, I mean, what was the complaint about Vietnam? It was the media who discovered that the M16 was malfunctioning. You weren't going to learn that from the chain of command. That it was from the media you learned about the My Lai massacre. It was from the media you learned that the war was not going the way the officials were saying it was going, that the body counts were falsified and all that sort of thing. Well, there was nothing there that involved national security. It all involved news that was embarrassing to the military in Vietnam. And I think there was no single example that anybody can point to of any violation of operational security in Vietnam or in Korea, for that matter. So that I think a lot of this, but if you look in the aftermath of Grenada, there was a lot of reporting about how inept the operation had been and how inept the forces that went into Grenada were. Well, I think that the military decided, okay, this time around it's going to be the good news war. We're going to put out only what we want, and we're not going to risk any kind of erosion in public support of the war because of what those guys out there in the media report.
So one of the problems is kill the messenger.
Yeah, I mean, that's sure. I mean, there's a perfect example. We did the mic checkup beforehand here. You remember the famous case when Ronald Reagan, doing a mic checkup, said, I've just passed legislation outlawing the Soviet Union forever. The bombing begins in 5 minutes. Well, there was a big hullabaloo because the media reported what he said. He and some of his friends then blamed the media for the uproar for having reported what he said instead of blaming him for what he said. So it still happens.
I have another question in this area, and I'll come back after Janelle has her series. But also, I've read some reports in the New York Times that indicated that it is now being analyzed that maybe media made a mistake in their negotiations with the military in relation to the pool, afraid that if they did not make that agreement, that they would be scooped by some other segment of the media that would make that agreement. Is that a valid statement?
I don't know all of the background of the negotiations, but I talked to the bureau chief of Time magazine, Stanley Cloud, who was involved in the negotiations with the Pentagon, and he said he was appalled. He'd been away from Washington, had come back, was named bureau chief of Time magazine, and he said the media gave up the game from the very beginning. Once they accepted the pool, in effect, they were dead. And he said, therefore, after that, it was just negotiating ground rules. And his point was he wished he had gotten involved sooner so that he might have been able to try to resist the pool operation. There was a wonderful line from a critic of the New York Times, Walter Goodman, who pointed out, he said, the military achieved ground superiority over the media long before they gained air superiority over the Iraqis. And that was quite true. But it was, once they bought the pool, in effect, they were dead.
Thank you. Janelle Burt.
Well, along the same line, how much is too much? How much is too much to report? And if you're telling bad news, should the bad news be reported along with the good news? And when does the press begin to insert their own values or their own opinions into the report?
Well, when you talk about the press having their own values and their own opinions, I mean, the press has the same values that you have, that the readers have, and that's what the press is, in effect. You know, we're all reflecting those values. The point is that once you start to try to tell the press what to cover, then you distort those values, as you did, as the country did, or as the military did in Grenada. That was a blatant act of censorship, which was more conducive to dictatorship than to democracy. Now, there has to be always, I heard that you were a lawyer, you know, there has to be a balance, say, between the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. In the case of a trial, what is the right of privacy versus the people's right to know, or the guarantee of the press to be unfettered in its coverage? I think the same thing operates in a military conflict. It's very difficult for people at large to understand even the concept, say, of objectivity. Now, we can't be totally objective. I acknowledge that. And what my explanation is that we can always be totally fair, and we can and should be always accurate. Objective becomes, you know, we're real people. We have opinions. We love our country. We want our country to prevail in this situation. But we do not go to combat or to combat situations as private people. We go as reporters. We do not go as editorial writers. We go as reporters. When I covered the South, I knew the difference between right and wrong and what was going on in Birmingham and Selma, but I was not there to write an editorial. I was there to report what was happening, good or bad, and the same thing applies. Now, as I say, it's very difficult for the public at large to understand the concept of objectivity when you're engaged in military operations. But we shouldn't be there as cheerleaders. And I object, and I object fairly strongly, I must say, to reporters on the air or in the field or in the studio talking about we and they. It's not we and they. It's all them when you're covering.
And when in this coverage process, how do you decide you must know more facts sometimes than what you're going to give the public? In other words, you've covered campaigns, and you must certainly have known certain other things that were going on. How do you decide what's newsworthy and what's not?
And you know, one of the big complaints about anybody who covered Vietnam was that a guy would go out in the field and they'd be shot at and the bombs would be going off and there'd be these terrible situations, and he'd be out there for 6 months and come back a wreck. And he'd go out, talk to a group, and somebody would stand up and say, well, tell us what's really going on out there. Our job is to tell you what we find out. We don't know a lot more that goes on in a campaign. I mean, our job is to tell you everything we know that goes on in the campaign or goes on in the Gulf. Now, there was a time, going back 30 years ago, when I first went to Washington, there was something called the Mississippi Rule. I have no idea where the name came from. But in effect, it meant that you reported on officials only on their official capacity. John Kennedy was fooling around in the White House. That had nothing to do with how he performed as president. Mendel Rivers was a drunk and showed up at, as long as he showed up sober at hearings, didn't make any difference. Guys, any of the off-duty antics were not covered. That was the rule. Now, what happened afterwards? You went through Vietnam, where the media felt they were consistently lied to and deliberately lied to. You had the famed credibility gap of Lyndon Johnson's time. You had Watergate, where again, we were consistently lied to. There was constant deceit and cover-up. And there was a mood change and a definite change in the relationship between the media and officialdom. And so the Mississippi Rule somehow disappeared in all of that. So you're not faced with that. I mean, the Gary Hart case is the perfect example, I guess, of that. But essentially, when we go out to report, it's a bad thing for you if you find reporters who are not telling you everything they find out. That's their job.
I guess one of the dilemmas that I perceive as a friend of the First Amendment, and I truly am, and without a free press, you do not have a democracy. Yet polls that we see indicate that the great majority of American people have a negative attitude toward the media in general, and particularly in the case of war. And there were calls that were coming in, as you well know, during the particular Persian Gulf War that indicated that even things that had been cleared, they were complaining to the reporters for covering it. How do we protect the freedom of the press and the First Amendment with this negative attitude toward the press?
I think the best way you do it is by doing your job as well as you can. Ultimately, I think the people come around. As I said, in Grenada, it was overwhelmingly in favor of the censorship, and 6 months later, the public opinion poll shifted. Now, I doubt that will happen this time because of the nature of the victory and the euphoria and all of that. But I think what you find, it's a lot like Congress. People in polls, in effect, ridicule Congress, but they tend to like their own congressman. And obviously, they vote him back into office every time, so at the rate of something like 98%. I think the same thing happens with the media. The media as this group somehow is seen as bad or too pushy or whatever, as long as when they're goring your acts. But if they're goring somebody else's acts, then you don't mind the media too much. I think, as someone once said, the media wants us to be a watchdog, but not when we're watching somebody they like a lot. And that basically is the problem. So if we expose wrongdoing and corruption, and it's somebody they don't like, they're all for it. But if we do it with someone they like, then they say, oh, you guys are too pushy and you're asking too many questions. Now, another problem here in the Gulf War, there's the old saying, as you know, that you should never see laws and sausages being made. Well, I think the same thing applies to a story because the people don't understand the process. They don't see the Pentagon briefings live normally. They don't understand the reporters are there pushing and prying and asking provocative questions in an effort to get a little more information from these guys who are there to hold back information. They don't know that a lot of the stuff that comes on the air or is in print may be supplied privately by an official. In the days of instant analysis, you may remember, I was covering the White House, and everybody, well, the same kind of, the polls show people disliked instant analysis. What they didn't know was that before Nixon's speech, we'd be called in, Henry Kissinger would brief us and say there are certain things the president cannot say publicly because of this and that and that. But this is the message he wants to get across. And of course, we, being good little guys, would go out and make believe we were on the inside and say, meanwhile, official sources say. Now, we were being used to a degree, but there's always a kind of a trade-off. You are used to a degree in exchange for information. So that's the long answer to your question. But I think if you keep at it, the people ultimately understand. As I repeat, though, the point about the military operation, it's very difficult in a time of war when people are dying to make them understand that concept of objectivity and detachment.
One final question in this area, and that has to do with in time of war, isn't the First Amendment in more danger, not only free press, but free speech? And if one goes back to the Schenck case in 1919, the court even indicated that the rights were more narrowly interpreted. So therefore, isn't there more of a danger, or one must have a much closer support of the First Amendment in those times?
Again, I think that you have to have a balance in those times. You could make the case that a certain amount of censorship or censorship across the board may be required in a case like World War II, where you could argue that the very survival of the nation is at stake, and therefore certain restrictions have to be imposed. But we certainly haven't had anything like that since. Again, it is at a time of danger or emergency, the tendency is for people to accept a clampdown rather than understanding the best way to operate is to get all the information out so that you can make informed decisions about what's going on.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
You've had opportunities to travel abroad a great deal and to compare other countries with our country. What is unique about the First Amendment to our country's heritage, and how can you compare other countries with ours?
You can't compare other countries with ours. The First Amendment is unique. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. I mean, there may be some lip service to it in certain constitutions, but there is nothing like the First Amendment anywhere in the world, not even in as great a democracy as Great Britain. And when you first asked about the First Amendment, I thought back to the time when I covered Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. Castro was in power, and we were doing stories about how the communists were infiltrating and taking over unions and newspapers, and the newspaper unions, and forcing the newspapers to print certain things, or pulling articles off the front page so that the paper would appear with a hole in it. And I was at a convention of bank employees, and I got into an argument with one of the employees about how they're moving in, the communists are taking over, and look even what they're doing to the newspapers. And he was very indignant about it. He said, well, we lived under Batista. He was the dictator who preceded Castro. He said, we lived under Batista for 7 years, and they had their freedom of the press now. Now it's our turn to have freedom of the press. Well, his concept of freedom of the press was to control the newspapers. That was his idea of freedom of the press. Now, I covered a lot in Latin America. Throughout much of Latin America, especially Central America, there was not even the concept really of independent newspapers and independent press. So that you as a reporter go in with a certain handicap. They assume that you're either working for a political party or the CIA, or that you've been bought off by somebody, because everybody who works in their countries is either bought off by a political party or a politician or the government, and so you're not respected as a reporter. That's not true, obviously, in most of Europe and Western civilization, but in most third world countries, there isn't that concept, so that it's even more difficult to operate. And you have the idea, hey, I'm a reporter, you know, I'm the village idiot. I can go in and no harm will befall me, and everybody will open up doors and talk to me because they know what I do. Well, that's not true in much of the world.
And obviously in the Soviet Union.
Well, the Soviet Union, I have not been back since Glasnost. The Soviet Union was the one place where I really hated to go. It was impossible to work in the Soviet Union. And the atmosphere was so oppressive, it was almost palpable. And it was very frustrating. You would try in whatever small ways you could to beat the system, and even then it was very difficult. Sometimes you do even silly things to try to beat the system out of the frustration. Now apparently, I mean, I used to say that working in the Soviet Union was probably the most difficult place for a reporter, and that the phrase a Soviet newsman, a Soviet reporter, was an oxymoron. Well, I think up until recently, under Glasnost, that changed to a degree, and suddenly these people who had been doing, in effect, government work under the restraints of government, when given a chance, showed that they could be reporters and do the job as well, given some freedom. Now apparently that's starting to shrink again as the military and the right wing complain about what they consider to be an excess of freedom and an excess of reporting.
And from the viewpoint of your experience with other countries, what do you feel is the benefit of our system and our freedom under the First Amendment?
Well, I think the benefit, obviously, is the enhancement of democracy. I think there's no question about that. This is obviously the strongest democracy in the world. And it continues to be. And it continues to be, despite all the problems you have. I mean, ultimately, it always sounds cornball to say so, but, this is a country which ultimately puts its faith in the people and the decision of the people. And you can't do that unless the people know what's going on and unless they're informed.
And to what extent does the press serve as a check upon the balance of power?
Well, the press has come to serve as more of a check, I think, in the wake of Vietnam and in the wake of Watergate. Now, there may have been even a swing of the pendulum a little too far. I think that a lot of people in news, a lot of reporters, came to see their job, or approached their job almost with a missionary zeal. And they almost defined their roles as prosecutors. And they saw themselves as natural antagonists against the powers that be. And it may, in the wake of Watergate, have gone just a little too far. Every politician is not a crook, and a president can act, it seems to me, in the national interest without partisan politics being involved at every single step of the way. And I think in the wake of Watergate, too often the media tended not to give anybody the benefit of the doubt. I don't think that's where we are now.
Another area that is kind of inside information, U.S. reporter, and you're traveling all over the world, and you've had such a distinguished career, and you've had a lot of stories, and of course you had to bring those back, and the management, the producer, and the owners of the network must make some decisions. Is there a lot of negotiation or at times difficulty in getting certain stories broadcast that you want?
I can't think of a single case where I wanted to put something on, other than the normal complaint about, hey, my story is more important than this guy's story, and I should be on the air, and he shouldn't. Or I should be on the front page, and that guy ought to be on page 10, or whatever. That sort of thing goes on all the time. Now, I had the battle frequently at NBC because I don't like where television news has gone. Television news has tended to promote production values over journalistic values, and I had that fight with producers all the time in my final years at NBC. But I don't think that's precisely what you're asking.
Right.
The only cases I can think of when we had information that we didn't put it on the air, I found out, for example, that 6 Americans had escaped in Tehran when the embassy was taken over. Now, I found out because I couldn't understand why the State Department wouldn't say how many people had been taken prisoner and had been taken hostage. We'd have the briefings, and I'd ask the question, how many guys did you have in the embassy? Well, we don't have an exact figure. And I'd call up and say, how stupid are you? You don't know how many people you had in your own embassy? I mean, that's really stupid. And finally, I took a guy out to lunch and put 3 martinis into him, and finally he said to me, well, you're the one who's being stupid. Don't you understand what's going on? Some of them got away, and we don't want the Iranians to know about it. Oops, okay. Now, I called my producers and said, here's a story, but, we can't use it. I mean, this would be like giving the Nazis Anne Frank's address. Now, believe it or not, there were some producers who wanted to put that on the air and say, hey, it's a big scoop. We did not use it. NBC said afterwards that when they got out through the Canadian Embassy that we had sat on that story. I found out after the embassy had been taken over that the government, the U.S. government, was sending a mission, Ramsey Clark and Bill Miller from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to try to negotiate with the Iranians. I was the only one who knew that. We even got pictures of Ramsey Clark at Andrews Air Force Base. I went to Harding Carter, who was then the press secretary at the State Department, and I said, I have this story and I'm going to use it. Will you confirm it? They called back and said, please don't use it. And I said, why not? And they said, we don't have permission to land yet. I said, you'll have to take that up with people higher than me. So they did. They called the network, and the network agreed to hold up the story until they had permission to land. And there was one other story involving intelligence, which I went to my boss and said, I have found this out. There's no reason to disclose this. It involved the Russians. No reason to disclose this unless somebody else comes up with a story, and then we can do it. But other than that, except for some pressure from Lockheed, when I reported a cost overrun at the another cost overrun at that Mount Rushmore of cost overruns, the C5A, that Lockheed put some pressure on NBC, not through the newsroom, but the chairman of Lockheed wrote a letter to the chairman of RCA. And then, of course, when a letter comes down from the chairman of RCA through the ranks of NBC into the news department, everybody said, oh, we better look into this. But the NBC did an investigation, a big report, that many pages, and sent back the word to the chairman of RCA, who told the chairman of Lockheed that the reporting was on the money.
About a minute and a half, Janelle.
How about the use of pictures and the effect of pictures in reporting?
What do you mean, how about the use?
Are
they worth 1,000 words?
Yes.
Yes.
And are they truly as inflammatory as we sometimes think they are?
Well, the point about pictures, yes, they can be inflammatory. I mean, the thing about pictures is, what do you say with the pictures? You know, I can show you a picture, say, of a man and a woman having breakfast, and I can say, they got married and they were terribly happy. Or, even though they seemed happy, or they were happy for the first few months, but, you know, you can do what the words accompanying the pictures I can do almost anything with.
So sorry to interrupt, Mr. Valeriani, but we're out of time, and you've been most informative. It was wonderful, and thank you so much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week at the same time when we will do program number 5 of this series. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is videotaped live by Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to catch the North Idaho College Public Forum the same time next week on this television station.